All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here, and I'd like to warmly welcome you all to our talk and discussion on suffering and God from a mental health perspective. My name is James Wall, and I'll be your MC this evening. Just a bit about me. I'm a third-year student at McGill pursuing a Bachelor of Science with a major in physiology, and I'm also one of the club executives of the McGill Christian Fellowship. Now, before we get going this evening, I would like to take some time for a land acknowledgement. As organizers of this event and as Christians, we believe that God created all land on this earth and the peoples that inhabit them. We wish to acknowledge that the University of Toronto is situated on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and Mississaugas of the Credit River. A few hundred miles away, McGill University is situated on land that has long been the meeting place of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. Today, these lands are still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to be able to work and learn here alongside them. Now, first, two bits of housekeeping business. First, please let us know if you have any accessibility needs, and we'll do our best to accommodate you. And in order to contact us, you can email relevant2021@gmail.com. That's relevant2021, no spaces, @gmail.com. And second, when we get to the Q&A period later this evening, I encourage you all to not hold back your challenging or perhaps uncomfortable questions, but please do remember to be respectful, and we'd ask that you refrain from using inappropriate language. Now, to start us off this evening, we have a student who's going to share her story with us. So let's meet Olenka.
My name is Olenka, and this is the story of my struggling with depression this past year. It was a few weeks that I was feeling distressed, and I was telling myself that I hate myself even though I would reason why I shouldn't. And then the rough journey began in March. So I'm going to just walk you through some of my journal entries to give you a glimpse of some of the ups and downs. March 11 and 12, I had my mental breakdown. I couldn't stop sobbing. My doctor was away, so I went to off-campus counseling on March 22nd. I had my first session. I have a journal entry from March 28th. God is good, my soul trusts in him, for he is faithful to his promises. The battle belongs to the Lord. April 3rd, I got to see my doctor. I got diagnosed with depression. April 5th, I started my medication. April 8th, I realized that I was smiling after a very long time, and I started working. April 9th, my brain is loud. Will I ever get better? April 10th, I have another entry. God help me to escape my brain and thoughts. They're eating me alive. Holy Spirit, you're the helper. I really need someone to come beside me and help me and lift me. Help me, please. My brain is so loud. Trust in the Lord, my soul, for salvation only comes from him. Don't lose it. April 13, 14, 15, I was in bed for 3 days, except for going to church and counseling. April 15th was the most miserable day of my life. I was afraid of life and just wanted to crawl into a tiny corner. April 22nd, I realized I hadn't told myself I hate myself in a few days. April 30th, I worked very well. I had a meeting with my profs, and I was really happy. So this is the story of my depression. It was a very dark valley. It was like being stuck in a valley and not having a bigger picture and not knowing how the next hour would feel like. When I opened up to people, they were very understanding, some of whom had already passed through this valley, and that was very comforting. But I knew that they weren't seeing things the way I was seeing them, and also they weren't in my mind when things were loud. Thoughts were loud. And that's when God played the role that only he could have played. Psalm 139 says, Lord, you know everything about me. You know my thoughts, even when I'm far away. And in this valley, I felt known and loved. I knew that earthly possessions can go away in a blink of an eye. I'm Middle Eastern, but I had taken mental health for granted. And when losing it, it affected how I was doing my everyday life and tasks. In feeling unable and limited, I felt unworthy. I had no power to work, to love people, to support them, all these things that made me feel good and valuable. And ironically, I was a Christian. I knew about grace. I knew that God's love is a gift, that I hadn't gained God's favor by being good, that God loved me when I was a sinner, and Jesus had paid the price to bring me to God. And it wasn't because I deserved it, but it was because God is loving and gracious. So I knew all of these, but I realized that I hadn't fully grasped the concept of grace, because somehow When I was feeling down with depression and I wasn't able to do good works, I felt less valuable. And I had forgotten that I was created in the image of God. And again, God came and embraced me where I was. Instead of telling me to get it together before approaching Him, or instead of judging me for not being able to pray and do good works, He actually talked with me. He reminded me of His love, that His love is constant and nothing can separate me from His love. He reminded me of His promises, that they hold true regardless of my strength or weakness, because I'm not the one fulfilling them. He reminded me of His grace, the fact that Jesus had paid a price for my sins and that my future is not messed up because of my mistakes, and that God loves me even when I feel not good. And He reminded me of hope because I can cling to the Creator who's sovereign over everything. And I think one thing that I took away from that valley is that God has got my back even in the hardest of times, and that ironically no darkness is dark with His light. So there's a verse in Psalm 139 that says, "I can never get away from your presence. I could ask the darkness to hide me and the light around me to become night. But even in darkness, I cannot hide from you. To you, night shines as bright as day. Darkness and light are the same to you." And that's what I experienced. This is my story of traveling through a very dark and ugly tunnel with a very bright lantern. In as much as I cried and I begged, God didn't take me out of depression in the dark days, but I can testify that not even 1 second He left me alone and by myself. And He taught me that when I think situations are out of control and there's no hope, actually with Him there's hope.
Thank you, Olinka, for opening up to us and sharing your story with us. Now, our main program for tonight is twofold. So we'll first have our main speaker, Jen, and she'll give us her main message on suffering and God from a mental health perspective. And then afterwards, we're opening the floor to a Q&A session to follow with Jen and also one of our other guests, Dr. Goligher. And so I encourage you to write down any questions that you might have that come up during Jen's talk, and you'll be able to ask them through Slido using the code RELEVANT. And I'll also explain this more in detail afterwards, just in case you're unfamiliar with Slido. So allow me to introduce our speaker for tonight, Jen Watt. Jen is a counselor at Shalem Mental Health Network in Hamilton, Ontario, and has more than 20 years experience working with faith-based nonprofits. She works to create safe spaces for discovery and vulnerability in conversations on mental health and spiritual growth. She completed her honors Bachelor of Arts in Chinese Studies and has particular interest in the topics of attachment, trauma, and interpersonal relationships. And as a fun side note, her newest hobby developed in the pandemic lockdown has been watercolor painting. Now, without further ado, I'll pass it over on to Jen.
Thanks, James. Many years ago, two 15-year-old girls, we'll call them Grace and Jamie. Grace had been telling Jamie about meeting cute guys at the mall. So Jamie wanted to see how Grace did that. They arrived at the food court and Jamie noticed there was a cute guy over at the fish and chips counter. There were giggles and fake attempts to conceal their curiosity with the guys. Eventually, after some theatrics, the cute guy's friend approached the two. Looking at Jamie, he said, "My friend wants your number." Jamie was astonished that she was the person of interest. "Who, me?" He replied, "Yeah, you." Jamie replied, "Can I have his number instead?" Not having anticipated this scenario to unfold, she just remembered best not to give your number to strangers. Jamie got Steve's number, and they had some small talk over the phone. Suddenly, one night, unexpectedly, Steve arrived at her front door. Jamie answered the door, and Steve beckoned her to come outside. Standing by the driveway was another friend of Steve's whom Jamie never met. Steve gestured with a slight nod. "Let's go for a ride." Jamie looked at the sleek black sports car with tinted windows, engine running, looked at Steve in the eyes and said, "I'll go ask my mom." Jamie went inside to tell mom, "There's a guy I met at the mall. I talked to him a bit, but I don't really know him, and he's asking me to go for a drive with his friend." Mom, in her usual disconnected gaze, said, "Okay, sure." Jamie replied, "Mom, I don't know him. It's 10 o'clock at night." Mom replied, "Okay, go." After a few exchanges of the same nature, Jamie said to her mom, "Mom, just say, you can't go." Her mom said, "Okay, you can't go." Jamie returned outside to the walkway, dropped her shoulders and furrowed her brow and said, "My mom said I can't go." Steve said, "Oh, come on, who cares? Just jump in with us." Jamie replied, "Sorry, I gotta listen to my mom," recognizing what a loser statement that was. Steve turned on his heels, uttering, "Okay, suit yourself." With that, Jamie never heard from Steve again. Jamie was an existentially thoughtful teen. Does that surprise you? Jamie was well cared for in food and clothing and shelter, and by her hardworking single mom. Yet she questioned why her parents were divorced and why her friends had their intact families with a mom and a dad and a big house. Jamie experienced a sort of suffering and a sorrow where she could not legitimately access her mom's protection and she had to protect herself. While Jamie lives in a developed country where teenagers can have access to sports cars and Jamie has safe shelter, food, and clothing, Jamie's suffering is still legitimate. Suffering and God. As I considered this topic of talking about suffering and God, I really felt the weight of the heaviness of this topic. And of course, we always have to ask Google what Google thinks on every topic. So these are the images that Google gave me. Suffering, God. The heaviness is quite evident in the pictures. I did not look for suffering in black and white pictures. The black and white photos are what came up. Suffering has a dismal feeling. The word suffering carries with it a demand for respect. There's a solemnness around thinking about suffering. When I think about people suffering, I think of the dear clients who meet me now online, but before in my counseling office. I think about people around the world now who are suffering due to the pandemic. I think of people throughout history who have experienced atrocities in their lives and powerlessness to change their plight. Suffering is a difficult task, difficult concept even to wrap our minds around, and to do so in a respectful way. And yet, when we talk about suffering, it's natural. It seems almost to come right after the word, but what about God and suffering? The two go hand in hand. In Philosophy 101, when I was in university, I recalled being eager to tackle this topic of how a good God allows suffering, but I felt a grave disappointment when, after writing the paper and doing all the research, the academic engagement did not satisfy my existential need. And what I've now come to recognize that there was an unmet angst around this topic for me. It's tempting for this to become a mere intellectual and philosophical exercise, but it has its place. For our conversation today, I would like to set the expectation that we will not be engaging, well, I won't be, you can in the Q&A time, on this topic from a philosophical perspective. Some of those arguments and perspectives can be found online, and I encourage you to do that later. Next, following this, we shall take a look at the topic from a mental health perspective. Now, what do I mean by mental health? Am I going to be talking about depression and anxiety and how that's suffering? Not so much. I want to define mental health as the perspective as approaching this topic, looking at suffering from an emotional, psychological, and social well-being perspective. And of course, if we're going to talk about a topic, we need to define it. I define suffering as pain, loss, abuse, neglect that's experienced alone and for a prolonged period of time. Suffering is the experience, especially in isolation. We feel that angst, and it's that angst of being alone underscores something that should not be. We are actually social creatures, and I believe this is a wiring within us that has intentions, and these intentions of social connection have been put there in us by a designer, a creator, God. The experience of receiving and giving empathy and suffering is the embodiment of a creator's intention for humanity. If we're going to talk about pain, loss, abuse, neglect, the first place my counseling brain goes to is trauma. Now, in understanding trauma, there is non-interpersonal trauma. Natural disasters or tsunamis and earthquakes, they fall under this category, non-interpersonal trauma. And then there is trauma of the interpersonal kind. Interpersonal trauma is harm done by people, whether strangers, acquaintances, friends, or loved ones, and whether it's done intentionally or unintentionally. The impact of harm sustained in the context of social connection is more insidious than that of any other kind, especially if it's repeated over a period of time. Now, here is a picture of where traumatic interpersonal and non-interpersonal intersects. This is a photo of a dear father who, with thousands of others, parents lost their only child due to the collapse of a poorly constructed school building. The suffering he endures is initially because of natural disaster, an earthquake, yet the government officials are prohibiting any investigation into any corruption that has resulted in this unnecessary catastrophe when the government buildings remain standing. This is an interpersonal trauma impacting this man, his community, and for those of us who are learning about this story. A landmark study conducted by the US Center for Disease and Control, the CDC, sought to explore the impact of interpersonal harm that occurs in childhood. The study is titled the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, also known as the ACE study. 17,000 people participated in this study across 25 states. It revealed significant data that's sobering relating to trauma experienced through interpersonal harm or neglect and its impact on that individual through a lifetime. Adverse experiences are interrelated, even though they're usually studied separately. The idea that some people have a target on their head and bad things keep happening to them is sort of true. If a child has a brother in jail, other things would also be happening at home that are impactful on that child. Or if a child's mother is regularly beaten, it's not likely that all other members of the family exist in peace and are thriving. Incidents of abuse or neglect are never standalone events. For each adverse experience reported, the damage is exponential. Our nervous system is wired to avoid pain and suffering. A child learns to stay away from a hot stove because pain receptors are there for protection. Adverse childhood experiences set up a child to self-protect from the unpredictable ways of their caregivers and social relationships. A child develops ways to cope, to steer clear from getting too close to people. This dynamic then prevents a person from reaching out for support to help lighten their suffering. When one significant way out of suffering is increasing social connectedness with others. Mother Teresa, a nun who worked in India, Calcutta, and alleviated the suffering of many, many children. She knows suffering well. She is quoted to have said this: "There is much suffering in the world, physical, material, mental. The suffering of some can be blamed on the greed of others. The material and physical suffering is suffering from hunger, from homelessness, from all kinds of diseases. But the greatest suffering is being lonely, feeling unloved, having no one. I have come more and more to realize that it is being unwanted that is the worst disease that any human being can ever experience." Mother Teresa captures the essence of suffering well. Broken trust in relationships set people up for suffering. Suffering impacts our daily function, it impacts our productivity, and ultimately our sense of safety and sense of self. Early life experiences impact brain wiring and the nervous system at a cellular level. Adverse experiences are then connected to the diagnosis of disorders in psychological and physical realms. What happens in childhood? In our distress, we call it for comfort. We're wired to seek comfort. This is natural, and it's unnatural to experience pain alone. I've got 3 kids. When they were wee little with the flu, laying on the couch, incapacitated, that's when I would have to cancel everything because they want mom and they want only mom. Nobody else will do. Not grandma, not grandpa, not dad, because we are wired to receive comfort and we have an idea of how we want it. And when we don't receive comfort as children, we're set up to function in a way that paves the way for increased suffering. And decreased ability to cope with life's challenges happen. And then people turn to what are called maladaptive ways of coping, turning to substances, and these become ways to numb the pain. Now, a person doesn't have to have experienced severe adversity in childhood to develop coping in a way that increases one's chance of suffering. How a child learns to manage their intense emotions, such as fear, is really important and impactful for their lifetime. In suffering, humans are prompted to make meaning of their pain, and that meaning is conjured up by the presence and comfort of another. So if you were told, suck it up, or that your fears of the monsters in the dark were ridiculous, then you might likely engage in the world in a way that requires you to push down these intense emotions. And when you do experience these intense emotions as an adult, your knee-jerk reaction might be to push it down and tell yourself you're being ridiculous, because that's how you learned how to cope with these intense and uncomfortable emotions. As mentioned before, early experiences of relational harm has the most insidious impact on the human brain and on the human nervous system. Interpersonal trauma can result in complex post-traumatic stress disorders and also correlate with chronic and debilitating diseases. The experience of always feeling socially unsafe and alone is among these symptoms. Now, it might sound like I'm saying we're all doomed for suffering because haven't we all been hurt by family members, our parents or our friends? Yeah, parents do get mad at their kids. I get mad at my kids. But what the research has found is that parents need to emotionally connect with their children only 1/3 of the time for children to have a generally healthy sense of connectedness and bonding. That's all they need. And this bonding is like oxygen. Experts in interpersonal relationships state that a child needs bonding and emotional connection the way they need oxygen. Studies have found that in North America, at least 1/4 of the population feels alone and say they have no one to confide in. We suffer because we're alone. Pain experienced alone leads to suffering. Without going into the stories, we have heard of individuals choosing joy and freedom in the most unlikely circumstances. And I want to make note of the fact that the suicide rates in developed cultures and countries are high, and that indicates that wealth and resources are not necessarily means to soften and decrease suffering. Interestingly enough, scientists have found that individuals who extend empathy are also religious. There's a correlation, further pointing toward the human tendency of reaching for a creator God in times of suffering. When we suffer, there's a tendency to want comfort and support from others, and also wonder about existential questions like, why am I suffering? Why is there suffering in the world altogether? You see, suffering is the great equalizer of humans. And financial wealth might help you get out of suffering to a certain extent, but you're not spared from pain and definitely not spared from death. back to about when my kids would be sick, they would also cry out and say, "Mom, why me? Why am I sick? Why do I have to get sick now?" They asked those existential questions that I didn't know little people had the capacity and capability for. I have entered into some of these philosophical discussions with my kids and at levels that are suitable for their developmental stages. So, in being a mom, my innocent children have led me to see that moments of pain are reveal our wiring for connection, and we reach for comfort to ease our pain. I can't take away my kids' cold symptoms. To an extent, I can. But if they're still nauseous after they've had all their medicine, all I can do is be there for them. And so my kids have also shown me that it's natural to ask the meaning of suffering and how all of this relates to a sovereign being who is in charge of the circumstances. I want to reference a study called Soothing the Threatened Brain. It's a study that was done in Canada. Distressed romantic partners were recruited and participated in this study to see how increasing the emotional bonding between them can impact the experience of pain. One partner entered the fMRI machine, scanning their brain as they anticipated an electric shock on their ankle while laying alone. Then they held a stranger's hand and while waiting for the shock, and then they would hold their partner's hand for the last one. After the initial set of brain scans, the couple would undergo intense therapy to increase their emotional bonding and then return for more brain scans. The results were as follows. In severely distressed, miserable couples, in the first round, the person receiving the shock would feel a greater sense of calm when holding the hand of a stranger compared to holding the hand of their partner. Now, post-therapy, the second set of brain scans showed that there was a significant decrease in the individual's fear response overall. This was after the couple received intense therapy for bonding. Specifically, surprising results were found in that the individual receiving the shock even had a 0 response to the pain. This unexpected finding caused the researcher to even wonder if there was an error, only to find that the little blue dots in the brain scan show that the person was not dead and the brain scanner was actually still working. And from this, I'd like to conclude that good emotional bonding can alleviate fear and pain. The comfort of an emotionally connected person can cause us to even override our pain sensors. But I don't want to suggest or add to the message that's already really prevalent that you have to find a romantic partner before you can be happy, or even in this conversation that you need a romantic partner to alleviate your suffering. This is not true. Remember that these couples were at one point also very miserable. So what I will suggest to you is that you can start this process of alleviating pain and understanding your own story by seeing a counselor. And I'll share a little bit about what happens in the counseling context. I say context because it's not in an office right now, it's online. And as a counselor, I see many individuals who are suffering. I can say that almost 100% of the people who come to me and my colleagues are suffering and they want help. We support them by bearing their burden of suffering together and support them with skills to increase their functioning. And some stories cause me to want to cry out with them, to say, why God? Why this person? But it's not in my ability to change their circumstances. And it is within my power to offer empathy. I've discovered that the experience of God is in being with people. When one person is with another person in empathy, God's there. I believe in the embodiment of God's presence through people when we're suffering, when we know we don't suffer alone. A weight is lifted. Now I want to show you, this is from a picture, a screenshot from a Star Wars movie. These are deflector shields that you see. And I kind of think that there are I'm going to talk about trauma deflector shields. Now, what's happening here is these shields, for a time, protect the people underneath from being bombed. And as you can see, the weapons are hitting the shield, protecting them. I love this picture because when we think about trauma and suffering, we think of traumatic events, and how we do know that traumatic events do happen in history and in the world. But actually, the events themselves are less important, and there are protective factors that keep us from sustaining trauma. If a person feels supported and is able to process and integrate that trauma event and experience, regardless of the size or impact and significance of the traumatic event, they can actually heal and they can actually be prevented from sustaining post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, all this might sound really bleak in some ways as I'm painting pictures of child adverse experiences and trauma. It might leave some of you feeling kind of hopeless because babies do not choose the lineage. None of us choose the family environments that we are born into. It can feel hopeless. But I do want to offer some solid hope for change. There's a way out of suffering, and you can experience it, and you can experience God in it too. There's a concept called rewiring. It's a very new, somewhat new environment, new development for mental health. Prior to the 1990s, the dominant assumption of brain growth was that the brain develops in childhood and remains stagnant into adulthood. Scientists discovered that the brain continues to grow and rewire. That means the changing neurons, that means that the neurons can change their firing, and even brain cellular structures itself can change through the individual just simply paying attention to how they want to change. This means that just because you have a tendency to blow up at people that you love, you actually have the ability to change this knee-jerk reaction. Or if I tend to think a certain way about myself critically, like having low self-esteem, or if I am fearful and going to parties, these uncomfortable feelings can be resolved with help, and my brain can rewire. You're not stuck with that for the rest of your life. In rewiring, healing happens. In rewiring, our knee-jerk tendencies to avoid people and avoid pain can change, and we can courageously face the discomfort and pain and see what invitation is there for us in relationship and connection. I'd like to pose a question. Can it be that suffering is an invitation to a deeper experience of humanity? If you let others know that you suffer, you welcome them to offer the experience of being human. Vulnerability and bonding happens around sharing our humanity. When we show up for others and draw from our own suffering, that's empathy. Now, we are in a pandemic lockdown. Hugs are rare. The experience of being alone has been magnified. Conversations around mental health are very important right now. This talk on suffering might have increased your awareness of your aloneness and suffering. I hope this prompts you to reach out and experience the comfort of another, whether it be a friend or maybe a professional. It's vulnerable to reach out, but you can also reach out to also give empathy and comfort, because this positive interaction of human connection is what we all crave. It's been said that the deepest human need is to be felt. When we're with others, we want to experience being seen and welcomed. This need to be felt and seen is as important as oxygen is essential to our bodies. Because we're wired to experience social connectedness and to experience meaning and life together and not alone, the experience of receiving and giving care and empathy in suffering is the embodiment of a creator's intention for humanity. Thanks for joining today.
Thank you so much for sharing, Jen. We're so glad to have heard your message on such a pertinent topic in this trying time. Now, for everyone, before we move on to our Q&A, I would like to encourage all of you to fill out our follow-up form. And so there should be a link that just went up in the chat right now. So you can all click on the link to this form, follow me there. And so we'd love to hear feedback from you on this event or any others that you had attended this week, and also give you a chance to connect with us. So if you have your feedback form open, I'll walk us through it, and you can fill it out as we go. It should not take very long. Okay, so the first question, if you're there, is what campus you're from. And if you're not from a campus, maybe just select one that is closest to you or that you went to. So this event is organized by McGill and U of T, but we know that we have others from other campuses here. And so we're just interested to see how many schools are represented here tonight. Okay, so the next question we have is, which talk did you attend? So that would be this one. So click the drop down and click on Suffering and God. And that will be the one to click. The third question is, how did you hear about this event? And so this can really help us know what advertising methods were most helpful for us. So whether it be through a friend or a flyer. All right, then there are two scale questions about the event itself. Just click on one of the numbers. Then after that, so we're interested to know if you identify with a particular spirituality or religion. And so this really just gives us a gauge of how diverse our audience is. Then our next question is, are there any other topics that you'd be interested in exploring? And then the last box is if you have any other general comments or feedback. And so feel free to fill this in now or later on that box. And the very last part about it is of this form is just asking if you'd like to connect with someone from one of the Christian groups that organize Relevant, or if you want to connect one-on-one for further discussion about this topic or another topic about Christianity, or one of life's big questions, as we call them, that we've gone through this week. Also, if you'd like to check out Alpha, which is a video and discussion series on exploring Christianity, which I'll talk about a little bit more at the end as well. Or if you really just want to get some more information on any of these things, you can check these boxes too. And so that will be an opportunity for us to give you that information. And so if you do want to connect, please make sure that you leave us with your contact information. But if not, don't worry about that. We thank you for filling out the form anyway. Yeah, thank you. So moving now on to our Q&A session. So joining Jen tonight, we have Dr. Ewan Goligher. And so he has an MD and PhD and is an assistant professor in the Interdepartmental Division of Critical Care and Medicine at the University of Toronto. He's also a research scientist at the Toronto General Hospital Research Institute, where he focuses on characterizing the mechanisms and impact of injury to the lung and diaphragm during mechanical ventilation, and on the use of innovative clinical trial designs to test lung and diaphragm protective ventilation strategies. So he also writes and speaks on suffering and medical ethics at the end of life as well. So just before we get Ewan and Jen up, I mentioned to you earlier that we'll be using Slido to hear your questions tonight. So we can already see that there's quite a few questions there. So thank you for those that have inputted them already. But in case you haven't used Slido before, I'll quickly walk you through it. So you can go to slido.com, that's SLIDO.com, slido.com, and then you can use the code RELEVANT to get in. And so once you're in, you can type in your questions, and we'll do our best to get these questions answered by one or both of our panelists. And also, as you're on the Slido page, just scroll around, and if you like someone else's question, and if you want to hear more on that specifically, hit the thumbs up, and it'll bring it closer to the front of the queue, and then hopefully we'll get to that a little earlier. So now I'd like to invite our two panelists to get ready, and let's get started. All right, so do we have our first question? All right, here's our first question. We have it. Okay, so for one or both of you, the first question is, if God exists and is loving, wouldn't he just eliminate all suffering?
Super, thanks, James. I'm happy to take that question. So just want to begin by thanking Jen for a really thoughtful presentation on the reality and just helping us to get inside the head of what it feels like to suffer. And I think that was really helpful. Thank you. So I think this is an age-old question. If God is there and if he's good, then why doesn't he just eliminate suffering? What is God doing? If suffering exists, how can he really be good, or and at the same time all powerful? And I think the answer is, at some level, from the human standpoint, we really don't know. We really don't know why he wouldn't just eliminate all suffering. There's a whole entire book of scripture dedicated to this exact question in the book of Job. I don't know if any of you have ever read it, where Job suffers innocently and wrestles with this question throughout the entire book. And the interesting thing is that the book never actually answers Job's question. God actually comes and meets with Job, and Job has a profound experience of God's presence, his greatness, his wisdom, his might, his power. And at the end of the day, Job actually is never told why God chose to allow him to suffer. And that's a bit of a parable of our own experience. And the truth is that we will not understand why God allows us to suffer. But behind the question is the real issue is, could God have a good reason? Could God have a good reason for us to suffer? Could there possibly be some justification for why God doesn't eliminate all suffering? Because if there could be such an answer, then it's really just a matter of us being willing to trust God that he has such an answer. And I think the problem then is to show that there's no possible good explanation for suffering. And that's a really massive undertaking that really can't be accomplished. And I think when we look at who God is, and what he's like, and what he has done for us in his son, sending his son to die, to live with us, to live in our midst, to die a human death, to experience the depths of human suffering, to be rejected, to be unwanted, and to enter into our experience of pain. If that's what God is like, and if that's what God does in response to suffering, then he is the kind of God that I'm convinced has a good purpose for suffering. And even if I don't know what it is just now, I'm confident that one day it will be revealed, and I can trust him with that because it's so clear that he loves us.
Thanks, Ewan. That was excellent, covering all those bases. I think my counselor brain goes to usually thinking about the emotion behind why a person might ask that question. And usually there's always an angst, there is pain that causes a person to ask that question. And I'm not answering the question, but more asking the question, what is your pain? And there is a relationship with that pain of not wanting it to be there. And we look to God for that reason. And oftentimes people in that place end up stopping to ask the question anymore because the pain won't go away, and being angry at God doesn't actually help that person. But turning to him for comfort and turning to others for comfort ends up being the way out.
Thank you. It's a great start. All right, our second question, also to one or both of you, is what is different about the hope that God offers in suffering? I think it's up to your interpretation of what it's different to.
That's a good question.
Do you want to address that, Jen?
I think I need a minute to think about that.
Well, maybe I comment that it seems to me that the question is not whether there are different kinds of hope to be had to deal with suffering, but whether there's any hope at all. If we live in a universe where there's no God, where we find ourselves here purely by virtue of accidental processes, and our life has no real meaning, no ultimate purpose except what we can manage to invent for it. And if we find ourselves suffering, and then we're going to suffer until we die, and then we're gone and there's nothing, then that's an existence where there simply is no hope of suffering. The best hope that we have in that situation is distraction rather than fundamental deliverance from suffering. And so I think and of course, so many religious systems attempt to offer different kinds of hope. So I guess I don't want to suggest that no one else has any kind of hope to offer. But what I think is different about the Christian vision of hope in the face of suffering is that there is the full expectation that one day we will be completely delivered from suffering, that justice will be done and will be seen to be done, and that the whole cosmos will be recreated in a way where there are no more tears. That's how the Bible ends. That's God's big picture for humanity, is that we're with him, we're his people, he's our God, and there's no suffering in his presence. So that to me is profound, real, genuine hope. That to me is what's different.
I would add to that I would say what I was mentioning about rewiring. The medical term is neuroplasticity, which is how the brain rewires. And to me, that is a scientific word for the word grace. And where there is grace, there is hope, where newness can be born. An even better word is actually neurogenesis, where brain cells can be born from nothing. And that is a kind of hope, because I think when we think about suffering, it often has to do with our circumstances. And it's really hard to parse out suffering that doesn't relate to human connection. And hence my whole half hour of talking. We can't pull it away from human interactions. And so in those dynamics where we feel these are entrenched patterns of behavior that we have towards each other, there is hope, because God can birth out of what we feel like are despairing situations newness. And to me, that's the sign of a creator, and not just random particles thrown together that we came to be. And so that hope is connected with a designer God, rather than just by chance that we happen to be evolved to this point.
Thank you. The next question that we have is a little bit more directed towards the church. And so the question is, how can the church support congregants with mental health concerns aside from the typical "we're praying for you" response?
Jen, that's definitely for you first.
Yeah. Well, I call these platitudes. Another word for it would be spiritual bypassing. Look that one up. Is when people attempt to use spiritual words to bypass invitations to go deep. I think the church in general would be good to go towards areas like lament, praying the lament scriptures in the Psalms, because I think there is I think it's just a human nature, human tendency to want to stay away from pain. And so when we stay away from pain, we're not able to help somebody else who's in pain, because we can only enter into someone else's pain as much as we have entered into our own. So I think the switch needs to be that we all start looking inward to journey into those areas that we've been avoiding, and allow God and allow his people into these places that we've kept hidden.
Yeah, maybe I could just add, I think a huge role for the church is to help end the stigma of mental illness. Christians see humans as body and soul, and it completely makes sense that there's bodily suffering, there's spiritual suffering, psychological suffering, and all of these things interact together. So it's taking antidepressant medication is no different than needing antibiotics. These are physical realities that we need to normalize and help end the stigma. by embracing and accepting it's just part of our fallen world, that our mental experience can be physical as well as spiritual, and it's not a sign of personal defect. I think that's one really important thing that the Christian community can do.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned the medication piece, because that's often, I think, a huge barrier and a hurdle for anyone to overcome. But I think there's also, if somebody needs to consider medication, oftentimes people think, oh, am I not praying enough or not spiritual enough? Or, yeah. And that's often also advice that's given too, is to try not to go on medication. So yeah, I think that definitely needs to be mentioned for sure.
All right, the next question we have is a little bit more personal for each of you. And so it's, how has seeing suffering or thinking more deeply about suffering changed or shaped your personal Christian worldview?
So yeah, this is a more personal question. I've been interested in questions around suffering for a long time. A lot like Jen described early on, particularly, it was an intellectual problem we wrestled with to understand the meaning, the philosophical issues, the why. Of course, the further along you go in life, the more suffering you encounter, especially as a physician and especially as a medical student and then a resident in training. You see so much suffering, you see so much pain, you see so much death. And I don't think you get immune to it. I actually think you get more and more sensitive to it as time goes on. It hurts more. It's like a wound that progressively gets deeper. I would say suffering really entered into my life with the birth of my fourth child. He was born, and we were completely not expecting it. He was born with limb malformations and had to have the appendage that was supposed to be a foot amputated. He has a prosthetic and he has a malformed hand. And the grief that you feel as a parent for a new little boy born into the world who already bears the marks of deformity and malformation. And of course we love him and treasure him, but there is a measure of disability that's attached to it that's real. And even now, he's big enough now, he's a few years old, and he begins to ask, why I have a big hand, why is my other hand just a little hand? And he himself is trying to come to terms with this, and you feel the weight and the pain and the grief that things are not the way they're supposed to be. I really like the way Jen defined suffering, the sense that things are not the way they ought to be. And I think it was in that experience, in grappling with suffering, that I can say I was really thankful that I had spent so much time thinking hard about the problem of suffering, because when it came time for me to suffer, when it came time for my wife and my family to suffer, we were ready because we've given a lot of thought and concern to those issues. And we found that in that moment, the grace of God proved true, and we were able to continue to praise him. The hardest thing was to go to church and to worship. How can I worship a God who's bringing the suffering into my life? But we found that by God's grace, we're able to do so, full of faith and confidence that despite the pain, he loves us. So sorry, that's a bit of a long answer, but it really, in a deeply personal way, I've had to wrestle with these things.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That is, wow, that's so impactful and powerful. And especially when, I don't know, suffering for little ones is just so hard to bear. And as parents, not being able to change their reality is, it's a kind of powerlessness. For me, my suffering was on the front end of my life. I was kind of carted back and forth between two continents. I was, I think, from the age of 10 till the age of 16, some significant years of kind of living a nomadic life, living with relatives. And on top of that, I had parents who have a father, they probably have undiagnosed mental health issues. The stories that I shared was actually of myself, as probably many of you guessed. at the beginning. Mom was totally not available, and I had to parent myself. And just the disconnectedness from parents, that I had very minimal emotional connection from parents, as my dad had these grandiose plans of sending me between countries alone as a little child, so that I can be bilingual, speaking Chinese and English. It wasn't worth anything, but he saw that aspect of life more important. By the age of 15, I was really craving a sense of connectedness with whoever God was. My family was Buddhist in tradition, but I didn't find any comfort, kneeling at the altar that would be there at my aunt's house. And none of my family members seemed to even know how to connect or care for me. So yeah, a friend brought me to church, and I just craved. Well, I craved her family because she had an intact family, but I also just craved this peace that she had, and all the people where I met at youth group. They just had a kind of kindness that I never received, even from my family members. And not to say that my family members were not kind, but there was just a warmth that exuded from them. And from there, I started to process suffering. I was always asking these questions about suffering, and why is there suffering? Why was I suffering? Yeah. And then as I entered into parenthood, I think the suffering really came out hard, because I realized there was very little for me to draw from in terms of parenting. I didn't know how to parent my little ones because there was no knee-jerk reaction to know how to care for a vulnerable one. So I would say that's where God really met me. And I would say it's in my deepest despairs that I do know that God carried me through his unmovable presence, despite the fact of being utterly alone, yet also experiencing an utter comfort at the same time. And I don't think that's despair. I would have been able to make it through that kind of despair if it wasn't for knowing that I had God. And I do reference the concept of the resurrection power, that he overcame death. So if he's able to overcome death, he can overcome despair too.
Oh, thank you so much. That was a lot more than we asked, but thank you so much for opening up to us like that. Yeah, this next question is more in a theological direction. Maybe one or both of you could address this. And so the question is, can we blame all our suffering and possible mental illnesses on the original sin of Adam and Eve? And so we'd ask that you also clarify what the original sin is for those who aren't familiar with it in our audience tonight.
That's for you, Ewan. Take it away.
Thank you for that. So in the Christian worldview, we have the concept of everyone has a kind of big picture story of the story of the universe. And the Christian story is that God created the world perfect and good and beautiful, and brokenness and corruption was introduced into it in the fall. And for this reason, Jesus came to redeem the world, to restore it. And ultimately, it will be completely renewed and restored when God returns, and when in the new creation, the new heavens and new earth. So that's the kind of the contour of the Christian message of how we understand the world. Where the original sin of Adam and Eve fits into that is that Adam and Eve were the first couple that God created, who in an act of disobedience and distrust to God, a kind of archetypal act of distrust and disobedience, occasioned the entry of that brokenness and corruption into the world. So I use the word occasioned very deliberately, because it's not so much that Adam and Eve are the ultimate cause, but that action in the biblical narrative was the occasion in which sin began to have its effects in our existence. Now, there's important for me to emphasize that there's a variety of different Christian takes on exactly who Adam and Eve were, their origins and everything. I'm not attempting to settle that question here, but I'm trying to paint the picture of what Adam and Eve mean in the general Christian point of view. So, when we ask this question about can we blame, we're really asking the question of what caused all of our suffering and possible mental illness. And I think that question can be answered in terms of the efficient cause, like what were the actual step-by-step process. And clearly Adam and Eve initiated that process in the Christian story. Satan and the demonic kingdom had an important role to play in the temptation of Adam and Eve. So clearly evil pre-existed Adam and Eve's actions. And the actual origin of evil is, to be honest, a mystery. Ultimately, we have to recognize that if God creates the world and sustains all things by the word of his power, then he at some point allowed it deliberately to enter in. And so I think we have to humbly recognize that all of our pain somehow comes from the hand of God. And we have to express a confidence that ultimately has a good reason, a good justification. At the same time, he himself is innocent. And how you reconcile those ideas is considerably more than I can address like in 30 seconds. But I would say that is kind of how the kind of shape to the Christian view of this question that I would want to say as to the question of the origin of evil.
Thank you two so much. Unfortunately, the time has kind of snuck up on us, and we do have to let you two go. But thank you so much for your wonderful insights and those really thoughtful answers. Yeah, thank you so much for being with us tonight and taking your time.
It's good to be here.
It's a tremendous pleasure. God bless you all.
Thank you. All right, so for everyone else in the audience, before we let you go, we just have a few quick announcements that I'm going to walk you through. And so the first one is that I'd like to tell you all about an upcoming program that called Alpha that anyone can be a part of. And so Alpha, as I mentioned previously, it was in the feedback form too. It's an interactive series which engages people about conversations about the Christian faith in general. And so the sessions focus on big questions about life and faith and meaning in this world. And so as a snapshot of each session, basically there's a bit of time to connect. Alpha is a video series, so you get to watch a video, and then you can share and discuss any of the thoughts or questions that you have. And so we'd love for you to join us online. We'll be starting next week. So that's the week of January 25th. So if you're interested, please fill out the follow-up form if you haven't already and indicate so that you'd like to be a part of Alpha and leave your contact information so that we can connect you to one that to a group that is close to you. And even if you just want to know some more information about that, also please fill out that form and we can get that to you. So we have a short video of Alpha just to promote that as well. So some of you may still have questions about tonight's talk. And so if you want to talk about this further, or if you have more questions, right after this webinar, we're going to be having a post-talk Zoom session. So it's another Zoom call. There'll be a link that's going to go up in the chat. And so we'll be hosting that until 9 p.m. So for just under an hour. And so yeah, you can follow the link in the chat after this is done, and it'll be more of an open-ended discussion. And so we'll have breakout rooms if we have enough people coming. And so we can it's a space to process and discuss our thoughts on this further. There are a lot of big topics that were brought up tonight. And so we just want to provide you with an opportunity to voice your concerns or ask more questions that you may have. And so also, if you just want to listen, please join us. And yeah, we'd hope to see you there. So we also have a few more events this week. although I guess that's tomorrow. Tomorrow's the end of the week. So we have one more talk in the evening, which is titled, Where Do We Find Meaning in Life? A Conversation Between an Atheist and a Christian. And so there'll be more information on it online, so on Facebook, on our Instagram if you follow us, or also on our website at relevantseries.com. But if you're not busy tomorrow night, please do come. It should be a good conversation, and you get to ask more questions too. Also, from 12 to 1 p.m. tomorrow afternoon, we have an Ask Me Anything Zoom session. And so this is an opportunity if you have a pressing question about your faith, or maybe you have lots of questions that you've logged in the back of your head, come and ask George. He'll be the one that's running that. He's a staff member at Power to Change in Westminster Chapel, and so he'll try to answer your questions. You can even come if you just want to try and stump George. I'm sure he'd like a challenge, and or even if you just want to listen to other people's questions, yeah, always feel free to come to these events. And lastly, we have from 5 to 6 p.m. tomorrow, we have what's called a perspective Zoom session. And so in this session, you can talk to volunteers or other attendees of Relevant this past week about 5 important topics. And those topics are the nature of God, human nature, the meaning of life, the identity of Jesus, and the source of spiritual truth. So all big topics. And so feel free to come by yourself or invite a friend, and we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear from your perspective and just be able to talk about this more. So if you have any more questions or want to learn more about Christianity, or if you want to meet some of the Christian groups either at McGill or U of T, again, please fill out the follow-up form in the chat. I promise that'll be the last time I remind you, but we'd also love for you to follow us on Instagram or Facebook, where you can find ways to connect with us as well. Or again, you can visit our website at relevantseries.com. And so that's all that we have for now. So thank you everyone for joining us. I'd like to thank our AV and our coordinating team for making this possible. And Jen and Ewan again for, thank you for your insights and for your sharing and for answering all those lovely questions. And so that's all we have for you. We hope to see you guys again soon, hopefully tomorrow. And otherwise, have a good night, everyone.